age is only a number. And for these fighters, the passage of time was never going to get in the way of them achieving their dreams. These are the oldest fighters to ever capture a UFC championship belt. Michael Bisping, 37 years, 3 months. What better way to kick off this list than with a mention for the man who personifies the late career resurgence? Michael Bisping was never a pushover, that much is certain. But during his many years in the Ultimate Fighting Championship, there was never a point where his performances screamed future champion. But on the back of his grit, his immense endurance, and his excellent cardio, he stuck around, year after year, facing each new wave of emerging contenders. However, in his mid to late 30s, something truly started to change with Bisping, where a 2-fight win streak led him to score a narrow but thrilling hometown victory over Anderson Silva in February of 2016. It seemed like the perfect way to cap off his memorable run in the UFC. But no, the count was not done yet. Often, timing can be everything, and the famously hardworking and durable Bisping just so happened to be in shape and on weight when the UFC middleweight contender Chris Weidman fell out of his scheduled rematch with the champ Luke Rockhold just 17 days out from their UFC 199 showdown. The Brit had fought Rockhold before, losing after a dominant performance that culminated in a beautifully executed guillotine choke. As you would expect, Rockhold was as confident as can be, overconfident in many ways, that he could easily repeat the feat to defend his belt. However, in what was one of the biggest upsets in the history of the sport, Michael Bisping managed to land the perfect left hook on his adversary, beginning a finishing sequence that ended as he sparked the champ unconscious up against the cage. At 37 years old, Bisping had done the impossible, making him not only one of the oldest champions in UFC history, but also one of the most unlikely. Jan Blachowicz, 37 years, 7 months. Next up, we have the recently dethroned champion of the UFC light heavyweight division, Jan Blachowicz, another guy who virtually nobody would have pegged for a champion a year or two before he achieved it. It's not that Jan's a bad fighter, not by any means, but losses against guys like Jimmy Manua, Thiago Santos, and Alexander Gustafsson had quenched any real hope of him building off his stellar run in KSW before his UFC signing. Indeed, he had a well-rounded skill set, but during his first 4 or so years in the top flight, I don't know, there was just something missing. However, in 2019, that all changed, as Blachowicz opted to switch up his camps. Before finding the tool, the weapon that would propel him to UFC championship glory, he called it his legendary Polish power, which at first glance might sound like a gimmick. But out of nowhere, Jan just started sparking guys at 205 pounds. Brutal KOs of Luke Rockhold and Corey Anderson earned him a shot at the vacant belt against the highly touted Dominic Reyes, a man who many believed had just defeated John Jones by narrow decision. And though most of us were certainly guilty of underrating Jan Blachowicz, when his Polish power connected to the chin of Reyes in the second round, whatever doubts that we had were comprehensively answered. Jan Blachowicz, at the age of 37, had pulled off a career revival for the history books. And while it wasn't a long reign, a successful defense against the rising middleweight champion Israel Adesanya is as good a name on your resume as can be. Fabricio Verdum, 37 years, 11 months. Fabricio Verdum was already a household name in the sport of mixed martial arts before his second UFC stint began in 2011. Wins over Bigfoot Silva, Alistair Overeem, and Gabriel Gonzaga had done a good job at displaying this Brazilian jiu-jitsu phenom's skill set to the world. But it was his stunning upset of Fedor Emelianenko in 2010 that truly singled out Verdum as one of the most promising heavyweight fighters of his era. The submission that forced the tap inside the opening 2 minutes stood as Emelianenko's first defeat in 27 fights. But for Fabricio Verdum, he was only getting started. A return to the UFC shortly after prompted an excellent run of form that saw him get past Big Nog, Travis Brown, and Mark Hunt before a showdown with the great young champion Cain Velasquez was booked, a bout that would definitely decide the greatest heavyweight on the planet. And though Cain was, at the time, known for his immense cardio, the bout took place in the high altitude of Mexico City. And following a back-and-forth opening pair of rounds, Verdum began to take advantage of Velasquez's lapse in cardio, eventually finding a guillotine choke in the third. After forcing the tap, he became both the first man to submit Cain Velasquez and one of the oldest UFC champions of all time. It might sound odd to say, considering how widely acclaimed he is, but Fabricio Verdum remains one of the most underrated heavyweight fighters of all time. Daniel Cormier, 39 years, 3 months. To simplify Daniel Cormier's career down to his runner-up status to both Jon Jones and Stipe Miocic would be doing a major disservice to his position among the all-time greats. Sure, his time at 205 pounds saw him left eating the dust of his great rival Jones on more than one occasion, but even after his brutal head kick TKO defeat at the hands of Jon at UFC 214, DC was far from done. Gathering himself together in the wake of his most harrowing loss to date, Cormier took advantage of yet another USADA violation from Jones, defending his reinstated position as champ against the dangerous Volkan Oezdemir shortly after. Not content to sit and wait for Jones's return, Cormier opted to step up and challenge the consensus greatest UFC heavyweight of all time, Stipe Miocic. And while DC certainly had the respect of the MMA world at this point, taking on a powerful, dynamic prime Miocic certainly seemed like a step too far. So when Cormier went out there and knocked the champion out in the first round, we were all forced to sit back and wonder whether this man should have been at heavyweight for his entire career. At 39, he had just etched out a special place in history for himself, and while sure he came up short as the pair engaged in a closely contested trilogy, DC, through his heavyweight successes, had elevated his stock far beyond the limitations of his role opposite Jon Jones. A success story, that's for sure. Glover Teixeira, 42 years, 0 months. The most recent entry to our list comes in the form of the veteran Glover Teixeira, who managed to do the unthinkable by following a 5-fight win streak back into a title fight for the very same light heavyweight title fight he had come up short in 7 years prior. Teixeira, by the time he was nearly 40, was best known for his losing effort against Jon Jones in 2014, a battle that was an almighty mountain for him to climb from the get-go. On that night, Jones was the superior fighter, and with him, Glover in his mid-30s, common sense would suggest that he was on the cusp of an inevitable decline. However, despite the odds being stacked against him, Teixeira began to find his form, beating the likes of Thiago Santos and Anthony Smith before eventually receiving an opportunity to take on the champion Jan Blachowicz. Now, Jan himself, as we mentioned before, had a late career turnaround of his own, finding an incredible run of form to carry him towards UFC gold. But when the time came for these two men to throw down, in a shocking turn of events, it was Glover who thoroughly dominated proceedings. After a conservative but confident opening round, Teixeira stepped it up in the second, finding a hard shot that dazed Jan on the feet before eventually securing a takedown and a later submission. Not only was this one of the most unlikely career turnarounds in MMA history, but Glover, in defeating Jan Blachowicz, became the oldest fighter to ever win UFC gold for the first time. Glover's own special piece of history was set in stone in the recent UFC 267 main event. Randy Couture, 43 years, 8 months. And finally, we come to the end of this list, the oldest man to ever hoist a UFC championship belt onto his shoulder. And by the time that Randy Couture had further immortalized himself by earning a promotional title for the 5th time across 2 different weight classes, his status as a legend of the sport was already set in stone. Couture entered the sport at a relatively old age and managed to win his first belt at the age of 34, a time when most fighters would be starting to feel the onset of decline. But the natural was not built like most fighters, and through 2 titles at heavyweight and a further 2 at light heavyweight, Randy began carving out a reputation as one of the most revered athletes in combat sports history. But even for the great Randy Couture, fighting for what was to be his 5th UFC championship capture at the grand old age of 43 would have no doubt seemed like too unlikely a task, even for his biggest fans. And with a prime Tim Sylvia in front of him, the stage seemed set for the champ to add a huge name to his resume, furthering his legacy at the expense of this veteran's own ambition. Unfortunately for Sylvia, things did not pan out that way at all, as an early shot dropped him to the mat before Randy proceeded to score a dominant win to pull off the upset. 5 UFC titles across 2 different weight classes and a championship belt at the age of 43? Yeah, they don't make him like Randy Couture anymore.